The account of the Last Supper is given in four Gospels: Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 13. While each Gospel provides unique details, together they form a complete narrative of the significant event where Jesus shared his final meal with his disciples before his crucifixion. As the time for the Passover approached, Jesus knew that his final moments with his disciples were drawing near. The Passover, a time when God's people remembered their deliverance from slavery in Egypt, would take on new meaning as Jesus prepared to give his life for the salvation of the world. Matthew 26, 17-19. Jesus gave his disciples clear instructions on how to prepare for the Passover meal. He told them to enter the city and look for a specific man carrying a jar of water. This man, who would be easy to spot in a crowd, would guide them to a special room where they would prepare the meal. The disciples, trusting in Jesus' words, went into the city, their hearts filled with both anticipation and reverence. They followed the man as he led them to the upper room. Everything was set, just as Jesus had said. Mark 14:12-16. Mark's account mirrors Matthew's, revealing the careful planning Jesus had in place. The disciples, just like in Matthew's story, entered the city with the instructions to follow a man carrying a jar of water. Water carriers were usually women, so seeing a man with such a jar was a clear sign. With the man's guidance, the disciples made their way to the room, knowing that this place would become the setting for one of the most significant moments in history. Luke 22, 7-13. Luke gives a more detailed picture of the preparations. He emphasizes the exactness of Jesus' instructions, as if to underline how everything was unfolding according to God's plan. As the disciples followed the man carrying the jar of water, they might have felt the weight of the moment. This was no ordinary meal, but a meal that would forever change the meaning of the Passover. Jesus had chosen this moment to reveal something deeper than anyone could have expected. John 13, 1-2. While John doesn't focus on the preparations, his account shifts the attention to the intense emotion in the room the night before the meal. It was a time filled with tension and the shadow of betrayal. John sets the stage for what would unfold during the meal: the washing of the disciples' feet, and the unsettling moment when Jesus reveals that one of them will betray him. This dark cloud hung over the evening, but Jesus' love and wisdom would shine even brighter in the midst of it all. As the disciples made their way through the city, they couldn't help but wonder, what would this Passover bring? Little did they know, this would be the meal where Jesus would establish the new covenant with his followers, revealing the true meaning of his sacrifice. And as they gathered in that room, everything was set for the events that would change the world forever. The evening was heavy with emotion, as Jesus and his disciples sat together, preparing for what would be their final meal together before the crucifixion. There was an air of anticipation, but also a sense of unease. The air was thick with the knowledge that something momentous was about to happen. The room was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, and the sound of gentle conversation, but underneath it all, there was an unsettling tension. Jesus' heart was troubled, knowing the time had come to fulfill his mission. Matthew 26, 21-25. As the disciples settled around the table, Jesus spoke words that cut through the murmur of conversation. "One of you will betray me," he said quietly, but with a weight that silenced the room. The disciples were startled, their faces filled with shock and confusion. One by one, they asked, "Lord, is it I?" The question echoed in the room, each disciple unsure of themselves, unable to imagine betraying their beloved teacher. Jesus, with a quiet sadness in his voice, pointed to the one who would betray him. "The one who dips his hand with me in the bowl will betray me." There was no mistaking the meaning. The person who shared in the meal, who shared in this intimate moment, would be the one to turn against him. Mark 14:18-21. Mark's account adds a deeper layer of sorrow to the moment. Jesus didn't just predict the betrayal, he spoke of the severe consequences that awaited the one who would do such a thing. "Woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man," he said. "It would have been better for him if he had never been born." The weight of those words hung in the air, and the disciples were left shaken. They could not fathom the depth of such treachery, nor the unimaginable fate that awaited the betrayer. Luke 20-21-23. Luke's account brings clarity to the divine purpose behind the betrayal. Jesus acknowledged that his betrayal was about to take place, but he reminded his disciples that it was part of God's plan. "The hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table," he said, but he also assured them that this was the unfolding of prophecy. Still, the disciples couldn't help but feel troubled by the idea that one of them was capable of such a thing. They began to question one another, asking, "Who could it be?" John 13:21-30. John's account paints the most vivid picture of the moment. Jesus was deeply troubled, his spirit heavy with the sorrow of what was to come. The weight of Judas' impending betrayal seemed to take a toll on him. Jesus leaned back from the table, his heart visibly stirred, and said, "One of you will betray me." The disciples were perplexed, looking at one another, unsure of whom he meant. John, always close to Jesus, leaned in and whispered, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus, knowing that the time had come to reveal the betrayer, took a piece of bread, dipped it in the dish, and handed it to Judas. As Jesus did so, he told Judas, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas, with a heart hardened by greed and betrayal, took the bread and left the room. The moment he stepped out into the night, it was as if the weight of the world shifted. John emphasizes the darkness of the hour. Judas was not just stepping out into the night physically, but spiritually as well. As Judas slipped into the shadows, the disciples were left to ponder the implications of Jesus' words. The Savior was about to be betrayed by one of his own, and the journey to the cross was about to begin. It was a moment filled with sorrow and betrayal, but also with the quiet certainty that God's plan was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The disciples sat in stunned silence, each of them wrestling with the truth of Jesus' words. How could one of them, a close companion, do such a thing? But in that moment, Jesus' divine peace was evident. He knew what must happen, and he was ready to face it for the sake of the world. As the evening unfolded, a profound silence hung over the room. The disciples had just witnessed the chilling prediction of betrayal, and their hearts were heavy. They sat with Jesus, the teacher they had followed for years, knowing that this meal would be unlike any other. But even in the shadow of what was to come, Jesus took this moment to introduce something that would become a cornerstone of their faith, the Lord's Supper. Matthew 26:26-29. As they ate, Jesus reached for the bread on the table. With a gentle motion, he broke it into pieces, and then he held it up to his disciples. "This is my body," he said, his voice soft but filled with deep meaning. The words seemed to hang in the air, stirring a mix of awe and confusion among his followers. What did he mean? This was not just a simple meal. This was a powerful symbol of his sacrifice that was yet to come. He then took the cup of wine, held it up, and blessed it. "This is my blood of the covenant," he said, "poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples must have stared at the cup in awe. Jesus was speaking of something far beyond this meal. He was talking about his sacrifice, his blood being poured out for them, for all people. Then, with a tender look, he added, "I will not drink from this fruit of the vine again until that day when I drink it new with you, in my Father's kingdom." His words carried a promise. Though his death was imminent, there would be a glorious future, when they would all share in this meal once more in the presence of God. Mark 14:20-25. Mark's account echoes the same powerful moment. As Jesus broke the bread, he spoke the same words, "This is my body." Then he passed the cup to them, explaining that the wine represented his blood of the covenant, poured out for many. The disciples, still struggling to understand the full depth of Jesus' words, accepted the bread and the wine, but in that moment, they were unknowingly partaking in something that would define the future of the church. Jesus had transformed the Passover meal into a remembrance of his sacrifice, a new covenant that would offer forgiveness and eternal life. Luke 20-14:20. Luke's version adds further clarity to the meaning behind the meal. As Jesus took the bread and broke it, he said, "This is my body, given for you." It was a gift of love, a body that would soon be broken for their sins. Then, he took the cup and declared it the new covenant in his blood, poured out for them. Jesus' words were simple, but they carried profound significance. He was establishing a new way for his followers to remember him, a way that would bind them together in his love, even after his departure. "Do this in remembrance of me," he commanded. Every time they broke the bread and shared the cup, they were to remember his sacrifice, his love, and the salvation he was offering them. This was no ordinary meal. It was a sacred moment that would be repeated throughout history by believers all around the world. John 13:1-17. While John doesn't focus on the bread and wine, his account of the evening still captures the essence of sacrificial love. Instead of the Lord's Supper, John highlights Jesus' act of washing his disciples' feet. In an unexpected and humble gesture, Jesus knelt before each of his followers, washing their feet as a sign of his deep love and servant-hearted leadership. This act of service symbolized the kind of love he was about to demonstrate on the cross: selfless, humble, and sacrificial. Jesus' words to his disciples as he washed their feet echoed through the years: "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Through this simple yet profound act, Jesus was teaching them that love is not just about words, but about actions, serving others in humility and grace. As the disciples ate the bread and drank from the cup, they could not fully comprehend what was unfolding. The weight of Jesus' words about his body and blood being given for them would only be truly understood after his death and resurrection. Yet in that upper room, as they shared the meal, Jesus was offering them a powerful symbol, one that would unite them and future believers across generations. The bread and the cup became the enduring reminder of God's love and sacrifice, a love that would never be forgotten, even in the darkest hours ahead. The quiet hum of the night enveloped the room as Jesus and his disciples sat together, sharing what would be their final meal before his crucifixion. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a mix of confusion and concern, as the disciples tried to grasp the meaning behind Jesus' words and actions. But in this sacred moment, Jesus was revealing something far deeper. He was establishing a new covenant that would forever change the relationship between God and his people. Matthew 26:28. As Jesus took the cup and passed it to his disciples, he explained with clarity, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." His words hung in the air, filled with the weight of eternity. The disciples, still struggling to understand, listened intently. The wine wasn't just a symbol of the Passover sacrifice. It was now a symbol of something new and transformative. Jesus' blood, soon to be shed on the cross, would bring forgiveness for all who believed. It would establish a new covenant, no longer based on the laws of old but on grace, mercy, and a personal relationship with God. This blood would cover the sins of humanity, offering redemption and hope. Jesus' voice softened as he continued, "I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." In these words, Jesus not only foretold his death, but also offered a glimpse of the joy to come, the day when all believers would sit with him again, sharing in the fullness of the new covenant. Mark 14:20. For Mark's account mirrors Matthew's, but adds a layer of significance. Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." The blood was not just for a few, but for many. Jesus' sacrifice was for all people, for all nations. His blood would cover every sin, every failure, every brokenness. It was the ultimate act of love, a sacrifice that would bind God's people to himself forever. The disciples, though uncertain of the full scope of what Jesus was saying, were receiving a promise that would unfold in the days to come. Luke 20:20. Luke also captures Jesus' words with profound simplicity. As he passed the cup, Jesus explained, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Again, the new covenant was not a mere renewal of the old laws. It was a complete transformation. No longer would people have to strive to fulfill the law's demands on their own. Through Jesus' blood, they would be made clean, forgiven, and restored. This was God's grace, poured out freely and without measure. In Luke's account, Jesus is not just speaking of the immediate future of his death, but of the profound spiritual change that was about to take place. Through his sacrifice, a new way of relating to God would emerge, one of love, forgiveness, and freedom from the burden of sin. John 13:1-17. Though John does not specifically mention the cup or the new covenant in his account, his portrayal of the evening is deeply connected to the themes of sacrifice and love. In the upper room, Jesus washed his disciples' feet, humbling himself in an act of service that shocked and confused them. Jesus, the teacher, the master, knelt before his disciples, washing their feet as an example of servant leadership. He was showing them that true greatness comes not through power and position, but through selfless service and love. When Peter hesitated, Jesus responded, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." This act, while not directly tied to the institution of the Lord's Supper, powerfully reflected the heart of the new covenant. It was a covenant not based on outward rituals but on inward transformation. Jesus was about to give his life for his followers, washing them clean from their sins, just as he was washing their feet in that moment. His blood, soon to be spilled, would cleanse them, just as his humble act of service demonstrated the depth of his love and sacrifice. As the evening unfolded, Jesus was not merely preparing his disciples for a meal, but for the world-changing act of salvation that was to come. His blood, poured out on the cross, would establish a new covenant, one that no longer required endless sacrifices, but offered forgiveness once and for all. Through his sacrifice, a new relationship with God would be made possible, based not on works, but on grace and love. The disciples may have struggled to understand fully in that moment, but in the days that followed, they would come to realize the depth of Jesus' words. His body, broken for them, his blood, poured out for them, this was the new covenant, the promise of eternal life, the gift of salvation for all who would believe. After the solemn Passover meal, the disciples were still immersed in the emotions of the evening. As they sat together, their voices joined in singing a hymn of praise. The air was filled with reverence, but there was an underlying tension, a sense that something was about to change, something none of them fully understood. Matthew 26:30-35. Once the hymn faded, Jesus broke the silence. His words, though gentle, sent a chill through the room. He told his disciples, "This night, you will all fall away because of me." The disciples were shocked. How could they, who had followed him for so long, fall away now? Peter, always the outspoken one, was the first to respond. "Even if everyone else falls away, I will never fall away," he declared, his voice filled with confidence. But Jesus, knowing what lay ahead, looked at Peter with a mixture of sorrow and compassion. "Truly, I tell you," Jesus said, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter was stunned. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you," he protested. The other disciples, not fully understanding what Jesus meant, echoed Peter's bold pledge. "We will never deny you," they said, each one claiming loyalty, each one convinced that their love for Jesus was unwavering. But despite their promises, Jesus knew what was to come. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth, while the disciples clung to their belief in their own strength and loyalty. Mark 14:26-31. As the evening continued, the disciples followed Jesus, leaving the upper room. After singing a hymn, they walked together, still reflecting on what had just happened. But once again, Jesus spoke, his words not of comfort but of warning. "You will all fall away," he said, "for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." The disciples looked at each other, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief. But Peter, ever the defender, protested once more, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." Jesus turned to Peter with a sad smile. "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Peter, unwilling to accept Jesus' prediction, shook his head in disbelief. "I will never deny you," he said with fierce determination. The others, too, insisted on their loyalty, each one swearing they would stand by Jesus no matter the cost. But Jesus knew better. He saw their hearts, their fears, and their weaknesses, yet he loved them anyway, knowing that the night ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Luke 20-24-30. As they continued their journey, a new argument broke out among the disciples. This time, it wasn't about their loyalty to Jesus, but about something more personal: who among them was the greatest. In the midst of this squabble, Jesus paused and looked at his disciples with a calm, almost sorrowful expression. "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them," he said, "and those in authority are called benefactors. But not so with you." The disciples, their attention now fully on Jesus, listened intently as he continued, "Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves." Jesus had heard their argument, and he knew their hearts. They longed for glory, for power, for recognition. But in his kingdom, greatness wasn't measured by position or title. It was measured by service, by love, by the willingness to lay down one's life for others. He promised them, "You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, and you will sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." His words were a reminder that their journey was far from over. The path ahead would lead to glory, but it would be through sacrifice, service, and love, not through pride or ambition. John 13:31-38. After Judas left the room, Jesus turned his attention to the remaining disciples. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, but Jesus spoke with calm assurance. "A new commandment I give to you," he said, "that you love one another, just as I have loved you." His voice carried the weight of his final instructions. Love was to be their defining characteristic, the bond that would hold them together. Peter, who had been listening intently, couldn't hold back his questions. "Lord, where are you going?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. He didn't fully understand why Jesus was saying these things, why he was talking about leaving. Jesus replied, his tone gentle yet firm, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." Peter, always eager to follow, looked up at Jesus with determination. "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." But Jesus, with a quiet sadness in his eyes, looked at Peter and said, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, I tell you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times." Peter's heart sank. The words pierced him deeply, for he had vowed his loyalty, but Jesus knew the truth: he would deny him before the dawn. And though Peter could not yet fully comprehend, he would soon face the breaking of his own heart, the realization of his own weakness. This moment in the story captures the raw emotion and tension of the night. The disciples, who had walked with Jesus through countless miracles, were now faced with the reality of their own fears and weaknesses. Their loyalty to Jesus was strong, but their understanding was still limited. They couldn't yet see that true greatness, true strength, would come through humility, sacrifice, and love. And as for Peter, his bold proclamations would soon be tested, and the pain of his denial would leave an indelible mark on his heart, a reminder of the depth of Jesus' love, and the power of grace in the face of failure. As the evening unfolded, the atmosphere in the upper room was heavy with anticipation. The disciples had just shared the Passover meal with Jesus, and they could sense that something significant was about to happen. The air was thick with uncertainty and a deep sense of sorrow, as Jesus spoke of his imminent departure. Matthew 26:31-35. Breaking the silence, Jesus made a shocking prediction: "This night, you will all fall away because of me." The words hit the disciples like a cold wave, and confusion spread across the room. Fall away, they thought. How could they, the ones who had followed him so faithfully, fall away now? Peter, ever bold, immediately protested, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." His voice was firm, his eyes filled with determination. He couldn't imagine abandoning Jesus, not after all they had been through together. But Jesus, his gaze steady and knowing, replied softly, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter's heart sank, but his pride pushed back. "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you," he exclaimed, his words filled with conviction. The other disciples, too, echoed Peter's bold promises. But Jesus knew better. He knew what lay ahead, how fear would soon overwhelm them, how their faith would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Mark 14:27-31. The night continued, and Jesus' prediction weighed heavily on the disciples. "You will all fall away," he repeated, his voice sorrowful yet resolute. "For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." The disciples looked at each other, bewildered. How could they, the closest to Jesus, possibly scatter now? But Peter, ever the defender, was quick to speak up. "Even if all fall away, I will not." His voice was full of passion and certainty. "I will never deny you," he insisted, determined to prove his loyalty. But Jesus, with a somber look in his eyes, gently warned, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." Despite Jesus' prediction, Peter couldn't fathom such a thing. "If I must die with you, I will not deny you," he vowed again. The other disciples, still not fully grasping what was happening, joined in the same protest. Their love for Jesus was unwavering, or so they believed. Little did they know, their faith would soon be tested in ways they never expected. Luke 20:31-30. For the conversation took a more personal turn, when Jesus singled out Peter. "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat," he said, his tone heavy with concern. The disciples fell silent, the gravity of Jesus' words sinking in. What did he mean by being sifted like wheat? Peter, his heart pounding, tried to steady his voice. "Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death." He was confident that nothing, not even danger, could separate him from Jesus. But Jesus, gently shaking his head, looked into Peter's eyes with deep compassion. "I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me." Peter's resolve remained firm, but Jesus knew his heart, his love for him, and the trials that lay ahead. Jesus wasn't angry with Peter, he was preparing him. He was praying for him, knowing that despite his confidence, Peter's faith would falter before the night was over. But Jesus also knew that this moment, this trial, would shape Peter in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. John 13:30-35. After Judas had left the room, Jesus turned his attention to the remaining disciples. There was a weighty silence as they waited for his next words, knowing that something profound was coming. "A new commandment I give to you," Jesus began, his voice calm but filled with authority, "that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." The disciples listened intently, feeling the full weight of Jesus' words. They had seen Jesus love them in ways they could never have imagined, through acts of service, words of encouragement, and unwavering patience. Jesus was calling them to love in the same way, selflessly, sacrificially, and without condition. Jesus continued, "By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." His words were clear. Love would be their defining trait, the thing that set them apart from the world. It would be the mark of their discipleship, the evidence that they truly followed him. This was the kind of love that would transcend all boundaries, even death itself. It was a love that would carry them through the darkest days ahead. As the disciples absorbed these words, they began to understand that this new commandment wasn't just about loving those who were easy to love. It was about loving even in the face of betrayal, failure, and hardship. Jesus knew that they would struggle, that they would falter, and that they would fall short in many ways. Yet, he also knew that his love would never fail them, and it would be this love that would hold them together and strengthen them for the journey ahead. Through their brokenness, their fear, and their failure, Jesus' love would be the light that guided them, and it would be the same love that would transform the world. Matthew 26:36-46, Mark 14:30-42, Luke 22:39-46, John 13:31-32. It was a night unlike any other. The city of Jerusalem was quiet, the streets dark and still, as the disciples followed Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane. The moonlight cast long shadows over the olive trees, and the cool breeze rustled the leaves, creating a sense of peace. But for Jesus, the atmosphere was filled with a heavy burden. He knew what awaited him, and his heart was troubled. As they reached the garden, Jesus turned to his disciples and spoke, his voice tinged with sadness. "Sit here while I go over there and pray," he said. He then took Peter, James, and John with him, and as they walked deeper into the garden, Jesus' sorrow grew even more intense. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he confessed, his words heavy with emotion. "Stay here and keep watch with me." The 3 disciples could see the deep anguish in Jesus' eyes, but did not fully understand what he was feeling. They nodded in silence, unaware of the weight he carried. Jesus moved a little farther away, knelt down, and began to pray. His heart was torn, and he struggled within himself. "Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus' prayer echoed through the garden, his words soft but filled with deep emotion. The cup he spoke of was the suffering he would soon face, the betrayal, the pain, the death on the cross. It was the hardest moment of his life. Yet, in the midst of his suffering, he submitted his will to God, trusting that God's plan was greater than his own fear and anguish. After praying, Jesus rose and returned to his disciples. He found them asleep. Their eyes were heavy, and despite his request, they had fallen into a deep sleep. He looked at Peter and gently said, "Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." The disciples woke, groggy and confused, but Jesus was already retreating again to pray. This time, his prayer was even more earnest, as his heart poured out before God. "Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." As Jesus prayed with such intensity, the weight of the moment became even clearer. His body trembled, and his sweat fell like drops of blood onto the ground. The anguish he felt was so great that even his physical form seemed to reflect the inner turmoil. The garden was eerily silent, save for the sound of his voice crying out to God. Luke's account adds something remarkable. An angel appeared from heaven, strengthening Jesus in his time of need. This heavenly messenger, sent by God, gave Jesus the strength to continue his prayer. Yet, even with this divine assistance, the pain did not fade. Jesus' submission to God's will remained unwavering, despite the immense sorrow that pressed upon him. After another moment of prayer, Jesus returned once again to his disciples, finding them asleep once more. He shook his head in quiet sadness, but his love for them did not waver. "Are you still sleeping and resting?" he asked softly. "The hour has come, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." The time for prayer had ended. Jesus, knowing what was about to unfold, rose from his knees and prepared himself for what would come next. Judas, the one who would betray him, was on his way, leading the soldiers to arrest him. The disciples, still sleepy and confused, would soon be shaken by the events that followed, but Jesus had prepared them for this moment, even though they didn't fully understand. In the midst of his prayer, Jesus also shared words of hope with his disciples. In his final teachings, he promised the coming of the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, who would strengthen and guide them after his departure. Though he was about to face the greatest trial of his life, Jesus wanted them to know that he was not abandoning them. He would leave, but his Spirit would remain with them. The disciples did not fully grasp the significance of Jesus' words that night. They didn't understand the depth of his suffering, or the strength he was drawing from God. But they would come to understand later, after the resurrection, that the love and sacrifice Jesus showed in that garden were part of the greatest act of love the world would ever know. This night in the Garden of Gethsemane was a moment of submission, prayer, and surrender. Jesus, facing the agony of the cross, chose to follow God's will, trusting in his plan even though it meant great suffering. His prayer in the garden became a symbol of obedience and faithfulness, a model for all believers in times of trial and hardship. Through his example, Jesus taught his disciples, and all who would follow him, how to face life's challenges with trust in God, submitting to his will even when it seems too difficult to bear. It was in the quiet of that garden, in the midst of his suffering, that Jesus demonstrated the depth of his love for humanity and the power of surrender to God's will. Matthew 26:47-56, Mark 14:43-50, Luke 20:47-53, John 18:1-11. The garden was still, the air heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Jesus had spent his final hours in prayer, wrestling with the agonizing reality of his impending suffering. His disciples, weary from their own emotional turmoil, were caught in a deep sleep. But the night's peace was about to be shattered. A flicker of light moved through the olive trees, and the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Judas, one of Jesus' closest followers, had betrayed him, led by greed, fear, or a misunderstanding of Jesus' mission. Judas came with a crowd of soldiers and religious leaders. Their faces were set in grim determination, their weapons in hand, ready to arrest the one they saw as a threat. Judas had made a pact with the religious leaders. In exchange for 30 pieces of silver, he had agreed to betray Jesus. Now, as he approached Jesus with a familiar greeting, his lips whispered the signal, the kiss. The kiss that was meant to be a symbol of love and friendship became the mark of betrayal. Judas leaned in close, his lips brushing Jesus' cheek as he whispered, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. The moment was heavy with irony. The one who had shown nothing but love to Judas, who had washed his disciples' feet and shared intimate moments with them, was now being handed over by a friend. The disciples, still dazed from sleep, suddenly sprang to their feet in confusion. As the soldiers moved in to seize Jesus, one of the disciples, Peter, ever impulsive, drew his sword and swung at the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. The garden echoed with the clash of metal as the disciples prepared for a fight. But Jesus, calm in the midst of the chaos, rebuked Peter. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Jesus' words cut through the tension like a sharp blade. The soldiers were there to arrest him, not because he had committed any crime, but because he had spoken truth that challenged the powers of the world. Jesus was fully aware that his arrest was part of a larger plan, God's plan. It had been foretold in the scriptures, and nothing could stand in the way of his mission. Turning to the high priest's servant, Jesus reached out and touched the place where the ear had fallen. Miraculously, the ear was restored, whole again. It was a moment of grace, in the midst of betrayal, a reminder of Jesus' power and his compassion even toward those who came to harm him. The crowd, stunned by Jesus' actions, hesitated for a moment. But the moment passed quickly, and the soldiers seized him. They bound his hands and led him away. As his disciples watched in shock and fear, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The one they had followed, the one they had believed to be the Messiah, was now being arrested like a criminal. As Jesus was led away, he turned to the crowd and spoke, his voice strong and unwavering. "Am I leading a rebellion," he asked, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me? But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." The disciples, still reeling from the betrayal and the violence, scattered in fear. All of them fled into the night, leaving Jesus to face his captors alone. The man who had healed the sick, raised the dead, and cast out demons was now in the hands of those who sought to destroy him. In the midst of the arrest, John offers a powerful detail. As the soldiers came to seize Jesus, he boldly declared, "I am he." The soldiers, taken aback by his declaration, stumbled backward and fell to the ground. It was a moment of divine authority, a reminder that Jesus was not being arrested because he was weak, but because he had chosen to submit to the will of the Father. Despite his divine power, he willingly allowed himself to be taken. Peter, still in his impulsive nature, tried to defend Jesus. But Jesus, knowing that this moment was necessary for the fulfillment of God's plan, healed the servant's ear and spoke softly, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" The arrest was now in motion, and the path to the cross was set. But in this moment of betrayal, violence, and fear, Jesus remained in control. He did not resist. He did not fight back. Instead, he chose to fulfill the scriptures, to walk the path of suffering, so that salvation could be offered to all. It was a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, God's plan is unfolding. As Jesus was led away, his disciples followed from a distance, their hearts torn and confused. They could not fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening, but in time, they would understand. They would see that this was not a defeat, but the beginning of the greatest victory the world would ever know. In the garden that night, betrayal, love, and divine purpose collided. Judas, in his misguided actions, became an instrument of God's plan, and Jesus, in his willingness to surrender, revealed the depth of his love for humanity. What seemed like an end was only the beginning of the greatest story ever told. The Last Supper is a pivotal moment in the Gospels, where Jesus not only institutes the practice of communion, the Lord's Supper, but also teaches his disciples about servanthood, love, and the coming events of his betrayal, death, and the new covenant. Each gospel provides unique perspectives and focuses on different aspects of the meal, but they all highlight the centrality of Jesus' sacrificial death and his command to love one another. May your spiritual journey be filled with God's grace and peace. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to inspire others on their walk with the Lord.